Welcome to a place of unseen stories. Your relaxation journey starts here. This is a story that aims to relax you and help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. But before you let yourself unwind, feel free to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Whether it's the dead of night or you're nestled up during a quiet moment, we love hearing from you. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us understand how these eerie tales find their way to you. The storm outside seemed to know exactly what was about to unfold. The howling wind rattled the windows, sending a chill down their spines as 6 friends huddled together around a flickering fire. The warmth of the flames stood in stark contrast to the eerie cold that had taken over the room. As the fire crackled and popped, shadows danced ominously on the walls, filling the room with an unsettling atmosphere, caught between a sanctuary and a prison of terror. The storm outside raged louder, mirroring the unease in the air, as though it were an omen waiting to strike. Tonight, the group wasn't gathered to laugh or reminisce about old times. No, they had come together for something far darker. True horror stories. Stories about the supernatural, strange encounters, and terrifying experiences that would shake them to their very core. As the storm outside intensified, the fire grew dimmer, its light retreating in the presence of the growing darkness that had started creeping into every corner of the room. The first to speak was Samuel. He cleared his throat, his voice low and thick, as though it had been burdening him for years. "I once lived in an old Victorian mansion," he began, his words barely audible over the wind. "It was a beautiful house, grand, ancient, filled with history and charm. But the locals, they had their warnings." He paused, glancing around the room at his friends. "They said the house was cursed, haunted by something far worse than just time. But I didn't believe it. I thought it was just superstition, a way for the townspeople to explain the eerie feeling that clung to old houses like a shadow." The wind outside howled even louder, the branches of trees scratching against the windows as Samuel continued. His voice dropped to a near whisper, his words heavy, pulling the group deeper into his story. "The first night I stayed there was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The house was quiet, unnaturally quiet. It was like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something. But then, as the days went by, things started happening. Small things at first, shadows moving in the corners of my eyes, footsteps when no one was around, doors creaking open on their own. At first, I shrugged it off as my imagination playing tricks, but soon it escalated. And that's when the real terror began." Samuel paused, his eyes dark with the memory, and took a deep breath. The fire crackled louder, but its warmth couldn't chase away the cold creeping up their spines. "One night I woke up," he whispered, to the sound of a voice, whispering my name. "At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe the house settling. But as the whispers grew louder, more distinct, I could hear it clearly. My name, over and over again." He paused again, staring into the fire as if he could still hear the whispers. "I tried to move, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear. And then I saw it. The thing in the corner of the room, watching me. It wasn't a person, not anything that I could recognize. It was a presence, a shadow that had been there long before I ever set foot in that house. And once I saw it, I knew it wouldn't let me go." The room fell silent. Each person there could almost feel the terror that Samuel had lived through. Outside, the wind screamed louder, like it was answering the story. The room grew colder. Then Emily spoke, her voice soft but tinged with tension. She, too, had a story, one that would only add weight to the fear that was settling over them. "I grew up near the woods," Emily began, her voice far away, as if recalling a memory from another time. "My great-grandparents owned a cabin deep in the forest, a place far removed from the noise of the world. Surrounded by towering pines and silence, it seemed like the perfect retreat. But there was something about those woods, something unsettling. The locals always said the place was cursed. They claimed it had a dark history. The storm outside raged harder. The rain, now, pounding the windows like a drumbeat. Emily's words seemed to draw the storm in, making the air heavier, more oppressive. As a child, I would visit the cabin with my family, Emily continued, her eyes unfocused, lost in the past. It was peaceful. Too peaceful sometimes. But as I grew older, I began to notice things. Things that didn't belong. Her words hung in the air, and the others leaned in, hanging on every word. There were sounds at night, soft whispers, almost imperceptible, like the wind was speaking. But it wasn't the wind. I knew that much. And then there were the figures. At first, I thought they were just shadows, my mind playing tricks on me in the darkness. But soon they began to take shape. Figures in the distance, standing just outside the cabin, watching. The wind outside howled again, louder now, like it was drawing their attention to something. Emily continued, her voice lower now, almost in a whisper. One night, when I was alone in the cabin, I woke up to a tapping on the window. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was someone or something tapping softly, as if trying to get my attention. I didn't dare look outside. Instead, I lay there in bed, frozen, too scared to even breathe. And then it stopped. But I could still feel it. Whatever it was, watching me, waiting. The room was deathly quiet now. The fire crackled louder, as though it were alive, trying to ward off the growing darkness that seemed to permeate the air. But before anyone could speak, Liz spoke up. "I know what you're all thinking," Liz said with a smile, but there was a cold edge to her voice. "You're wondering why I'm so calm. But let me tell you, what I'm about to say will change everything you think you know about fear." She leaned back, her eyes dark with the weight of a past memory. "I lived in a house too, an old Georgian mansion, surrounded by a decaying garden and an eerie quiet that always seemed to hang in the air. The locals always said there was something wrong with that house. They told stories of things that disappeared, voices in the walls, and people who just vanished. But I didn't believe them. I thought it was just gossip, superstition to explain away the strange events that happened in that town." Liz paused, her face becoming more serious. "But then, one night, I discovered something that I shouldn't have. I went up to the attic. It was dark and musty, but something about the air felt wrong. I found a photo, a very old photograph, hanging crookedly on the wall. It was of a man, but his features were blurred, almost melted away like they'd been rubbed out of time. When I touched the photo, that's when everything changed. The others listened intently, their breath catching in their throats. The whole house seemed to shift. The floorboards creaked. The walls groaned as if the house itself were waking up. And then the whisper started, low at first, just a murmur, but then louder, until I couldn't hear my own thoughts. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. And that's when I saw it. Liz's eyes widened as she recounted the chilling memory. A figure standing just beyond the window, staring at me with hollow eyes. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air grew heavier, and the room spun. Everything felt alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. Her voice trailed off, and the room fell into a heavy silence. The wind outside still howled, and outside, the storm seemed to intensify, mirroring the growing dread in the room. Finally, it was John's turn. He'd been quiet throughout the evening, but now his voice cut through the silence. "I know you've all had your experiences, but you've never seen anything like this. Not like what I saw. The truth is, these places, these things, they're not just stories. They're real. And once you see them, you can never forget." John's eyes glinted in the dim light, his tone serious. "I was hiking alone in the mountains once. A simple trip. Just me and the wilderness. But deep in the valley, I felt something wrong. There was a presence there, something following me. It wasn't just in my mind. I could hear it, feel it, like the ground itself was shifting beneath my feet. He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts before continuing. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But when I looked again, I could see a figure, standing still, barely visible through the trees. And when I blinked, it was gone. But the thing that really shook me was the footsteps. They were right behind me, getting closer. But when I turned around, nothing. The group was silent, each person lost in the terror of their own thoughts. The wind continued to howl, and outside, the storm seemed to intensify, mirroring the growing dread in the room. With that, the story came to an eerie halt, leaving everyone in a state of uneasy silence. The room was frozen, and the only sounds that filled the air were the howling winds and the crackling fire. But deep down, they all knew one thing. This night was far from over. With that, the story came to an eerie halt, leaving everyone in a state of uneasy silence. The room was frozen, and the only sounds that filled the air were the howling winds and the crackling fire. But deep down, they all knew one thing. This night was far from over. The wind outside howled against the windows like a chorus of lost souls, scratching at the walls with its cold, ghostly fingers. The fire, which had once crackled with warmth, now struggled to hold back the chill creeping into the room. Shadows danced wildly on the walls, their elongated forms reaching out toward the group as if trying to pull them into the very darkness that had consumed the night. But the silence within the room was deafening. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Each person's breath was shallow, their eyes flickering nervously between each other, wondering who would speak next, who would add their own terrifying tale to the night's collection. It was Emily who finally broke the stillness. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of something far more sinister. "I've never been the same since that night," she said, her hands clasped tightly around her chair's armrests, as if the memory threatened to pull her away. "You all have your stories, but mine is different. It's not just a memory. It's something that lingers, something that follows me." The others leaned in, their attention now entirely fixed on her. Her eyes were wide, haunted by something that no one else could see. "When I was younger, my family had a cabin deep in the woods. It was isolated, hidden away from the rest of the world, and that was what made it special. But there was always something about that place that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the way the trees seemed to loom over the cabin like silent sentinels, or the way the wind howled through the pines at night. It was something deeper." She paused, her voice faltering for a moment, as if gathering the courage to speak of what she had kept locked away for so long. At night, the shadows outside the cabin seemed to move of their own accord. It was subtle at first, just a flicker here, a movement there, but it was enough to make you feel like you were being watched. And then, the whispers started. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Emily's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes now darkened with the memory. "At first I thought it was the wind, or maybe just the creaking of the cabin settling. But no matter how much I told myself it was nothing, the whispers kept coming. At night, when the wind was at its peak, and the trees began to sway, the whispers would rise from the darkness outside. They were soft at first, like distant murmurs. But then they grew louder. Emily's voice trembled. I would wake up in the middle of the night to hear my name being whispered, slowly, deliberately. Emily. It would call, soft but distinct, echoing in my ears. And no matter how many times I told myself it was just my imagination, I knew, deep down, it wasn't. It was something real, something evil. The room was silent, the tension palpable. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, there was only the eerie quiet of anticipation. Emily continued, her gaze fixed on the fire, as though seeking solace in its flickering light. One night, it was worse than ever, she whispered, her voice almost too faint to hear. I was lying in bed, wide awake, listening to the wind howl, when the tapping began. Soft at first, like the rustle of a branch against the window. But then, it became rhythmic, steady, like someone was knocking. But there was no one there. I got up, convinced it was just some animal, maybe a raccoon or a bird. But when I looked outside, there was nothing. The trees were still. The wind had died down. And the tapping continued. Louder now, more insistent. Her hand gripped the edge of her chair as she continued. I thought I was losing my mind. So, I went to the window to look outside. But when I looked out into the dark, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of the yard, standing by the trees, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its shape was shrouded in shadow, its face hidden from view. But what terrified me the most were its eyes, black, empty pits, like two holes where eyes should have been. It reached toward me with its long, skeletal fingers, slowly, deliberately, as though it knew I was watching. The room felt colder as Emily spoke. The fire seemed to dim, its light flickering erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the town. I didn't even pack anything. I just ran. And when I finally stopped, I thought it was over. But I still hear it. Sometimes, when it's quiet, I hear the whispers. And when it rains, I swear I can still see its eyes watching me from the darkness. The group sat in stunned silence, processing the depth of Emily's experience. The wind outside howled louder now, as though responding to the chilling nature of the story. But then, Sarah spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of her own dark memories. I had a similar experience, Sarah began, her tone grave, her eyes distant. I used to work as a caretaker at an old cemetery. It was a place steeped in history, ancient and weathered. The gravestones were so old that they looked like they might crumble at any moment. The air there always felt thick, like the past was never really gone, like the dead were always watching. The others listened intently as Sarah continued. But it wasn't the day that was unsettling. It was the night. At night, the cemetery transformed. The air became suffocating, heavy with an unnatural silence. And there was one grave that always drew my attention. It was an old, crumbling tombstone, half buried in the ground. The locals said the man buried there was cursed, restless, angry. They claimed his spirit wandered the cemetery at night, seeking vengeance. But I didn't believe in such things. I thought it was just superstition. She paused, her face pale as the memory resurfaced. One night, while I was walking the grounds, I heard something rustling in the leaves. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But then I saw it, a figure, pale and translucent, moving between the gravestones. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, blank surface where a face should have been. And its eyes, hollow, black pits. Her voice faltered. It whispered my name. It said my name in a voice that wasn't human. And then it vanished. But it didn't leave. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was miles away. But even now, when I'm alone, I feel its presence. I can still hear the footsteps behind me. And when it rains, I know it's still there, waiting. A chill settled over the room as Sarah finished her story. But Clara, who had been silent until now, spoke next, her voice low and tinged with something darker. I worked in a mental asylum once, Clara said, her eyes flickering with a haunted memory. It was a place full of madness. People locked away because they were too broken for the world to handle. But there was something more, something beyond the madness. The room seemed to grow colder as Clara continued. There was a woman there. Her name was Evelyn. She'd been locked away for years, isolated from everyone. They said she was mad, but there was something different about her. Something dark. She knew things. Things she shouldn't have known. Clara's voice dropped, her words heavy with a fear that seemed to resurface with each passing moment. One night, I heard whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the patients talking. But then, I saw something. Eyes. Eyes that weren't human. They came from the walls, from the very shadows themselves. They were watching. The group shuddered as Clara's voice trembled. I left that place. I had to. But even now, when the lights flicker, I can still feel their eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. The storm outside had finally subsided, but the air in the room remained thick with the fear and tension these stories had stirred. The fire had almost died, its embers glowing faintly in the darkness. The group sat in stunned silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The stories they had shared had woven a web of terror that seemed to stretch beyond the walls of the room, beyond the confines of the night. They knew deep down that these stories would never truly leave them. The shadows would always be there, lurking in the corners of their minds, waiting to resurface when the wind howled and the rain fell. And as the night wore on, they couldn't help but wonder, what else was out there? What other horrors lurked in the darkness, waiting for someone to dare to tell their story? Thank you for joining us here at American Pulse and Paranormal. If you felt a chill down your spine, don't forget to leave a comment below and let us know when and where you're watching this. We love hearing from our viewers, whether it's the dead of night or a quiet moment in the day. Your feedback helps us shape these eerie tales, and your support keeps the stories alive. If you want more spine-tingling stories like this, be sure to hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these chilling stories to life. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop exploring the mysteries that surround us. Your journey into the unknown is just beginning,